Honorable Member Michael, South Central.
Thank you, sir. I know the honorable member for Christchurch East Central suggested that he would be brief. We all knew better than that. Wish that we would be brief, but sir, we weren't elected to be brief. We were elected to be rigorous and effective. So I think that the House will willingly indulge this intervention on this matter. Sir, I support the repeal of Cap 67B, as the member who led knows well. But I think that the bill that is before us bears some discussion and some consideration in light of some wider issues. Now, the original Cap 67B was very, very short, a piece of legislation of 4 clauses, 4 sections, and intentionally so, because really it sought to give full discretion to the Minister of Finance. And the truth is that it perhaps allowed for a multitude of sins among those who, in a previous government or administration, may have been so minded. And we always say that we have to legislate, not necessarily for ourselves, who are minded to act in good faith, but we have to legislate for those who may come after us, who may not be so minded. And so I believe that this new piece of legislation starts slowly down the road to where we want to be. And it does so in part by capping the decisions that can be made by the Minister of Finance. I believe it is at $100,000, so that, subject to the provisions of the Public Finance Management Act 2019, the Minister of Finance may by order grant an exemption to or remit or refund any payment made by any person in respect of the amount of any duty or tax where the sum does not exceed $100,000. So that starts to help with issues of transparency and discretion. For those requests that are in excess of $100,000, the exemption must be approved by the Cabinet. Again, that starts to go down the road towards the right place. But sir, I believe that as currently presented, the bill does not cure the wide discretion of the Minister of Finance on the matter of granting duties and exemption. And let me be clear. There will always be an occasion, there will always be purposes under which the Minister of Finance must be given some discretion and some flexibility to make certain decisions. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that that's not the case. Certainly we saw with COVID, where if we did not have in our legislative framework, or we did not make space in our legislative framework for the government to be able to act quickly, for the government to be able to procure overnight, the whole world was scrambling to be able to get certain supplies and to be able to do certain things. And if we did not have that provision, goodness knows where we would be today. So I am not so naive as to think that that power is not required. However, sir, I, again, hope that we're not missing a very important opportunity to go further. The honourable member who led the bill suggested that part of the reason for it is that we want business to grow. And I think that if we want business to grow, we need to have an approach to fiscal incentives that makes everything clear. We need to have an approach to fiscal incentives which sets out in one place, perhaps that a company, an entity like Invest Barbados can disseminate to the world, sets out in one place what are the requirements, what are the conditions under which incentives and concessions will be granted in each sector: manufacturing, agriculture, technology, health, sports, tourism, charitable organizations, importantly. What are the conditions under which exemptions will be granted under each of these sectors? And then, if they do not apply, or if the request does not apply under those pieces of legislation, then why would, or under what circumstances would I need to invoke or apply under Cap 67B, or this new piece of legislation that will replace that? Because as we all know, what was happening was that people would simply bypass a piece of legislation that they didn't like. They would know that something applied to them under manufacturing or under agriculture, but they would say, no, I'm gonna make this application under Cap 67B so that I could then trigger a negotiation process with the government so that I have more scope to be able to access the kinds of duties, the kinds of exemptions from duty that I may wish to have. And so I feel government must make it very clear the exceptional circumstances under which an application for an exemption will bypass these other various pieces of legislation and then can then be directed towards this bill that is before the House. And I think, sir, that a new all-encompassing fiscal incentives bill is necessary so that this can all be seen and considered in one place. Sir, the resources of government are thin on the ground. The question of examining an application for exemption of duties is an administrative exercise. And if you look at all the different pieces of legislation that govern it, it gives authority to different ministers. It invokes action by different public officers in different ministries. There is not, for that reason, an equality of the length of the process across various sectors. And so something in agriculture may take as long as the Ministry of Agriculture is able to respond. Something in manufacturing may take as long as the department responsible for that is able to respond. And anything that we can do to remove, one, the administrative burden of having to make a decision on concessions, and two, the discretion is something that is not just good for transparency and accountability, but is good for business. The value that an investor or a small business owner or a householder gets, or a returning national gets, the value that that individual gets from the predictability of knowing what they're entitled to, the kind of exemption that they're likely to be granted, that has tremendous value. I can know that when I come to Barbados and I'm making a tourism investment, that I can predict reasonably what I will be granted, and I can do all of my business planning and my modeling on that basis. And so I believe that we should not maintain a situation where we still have these pieces of legislation that govern different sectors with respect to the granting of exemptions from duty, and that are not unified in one place so that we can say to the international community and that we can say to Barbadians, this is what you can expect. We have, quite frankly, a complicated process with respect to the tourism sector. That's something, first of all, that I have to satisfy myself as an officer that the thing that you're applying for a concession for is a part of the schedule, the list of things that I have in my hand. And so I might say that I need, for my tourism investment project, I might need a lawnmower. And I am entitled to having a duty-free lawnmower. And then something comes in that the officer cannot tell whether it's a lawnmower or not. I swear to you that it is. But the administrative burden and the level of discretion and the level of understanding that is needed to be able to say, that don't look like a lawnmower, and that is not on my list, you cannot get that. That is an investment and an administrative waste that we can't afford. And so if we can have a system where there's a greater degree of predictability, perhaps you get 3% of the value of your project, and you can use that 3% to say, I want vehicles, or I want to be exempt from vehicles, I want to have that 3% go to this particular input or that particular input. It removes the burden from government of having to make a decision and having officers try and check something and try and develop expertise in all kinds of areas that they don't have expertise. Furthermore, sir, the conditions that are referenced in the legislation also leave a wide area for discretion. And so at 5, an order made under this act is subject to any conditions specified in the order. And so we don't know what those conditions might be under any future order. The Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central made reference to some worthwhile options. One is that if you say that your investment will generate a certain level of foreign exchange, it must do that. If you say that your operations annually will generate a certain level of foreign exchange, it must do that. Otherwise, you may no longer be eligible for those concessions. That's worthwhile. If you say that your investment project must generate a certain number of jobs, it must do that or is no longer eligible for concessions. Worthwhile. If you get these concessions, you must report, you must complete the balance of payment survey as circulated by the central bank. Worthwhile. However, I would like to see that stated in the legislation. I would like to know that the conditions have a certain baseline and then more may be added as necessary. But right now, as it is outlined here, any condition may satisfy. And so it does still leave some room, perhaps more than we would like, for discretion. Sir, I will be brief, unlike the honourable member who came before me. But I feel that it is important to understand that there are, not that this bill in itself is not desirable, but there's further that we can go and perhaps should go, and that we should not perhaps be tinkering with the big issue that we have to solve. The final thing I will say, sir, is that I would love to see incentives where they matter in this country. Obviously, we want to create a growth environment, a job-led growth environment. We do want business to grow. But there are also other things that are desirable and that we can use incentives for. Sir, I saw recently that there was some discussion of moving towards a salt tax alongside the sugar tax that has already been introduced on sugar-sweetened beverages and so on. I think that we need to exercise some caution. We need to exercise some caution. The health industry has had a history of demonizing certain food groups, demonizing certain nutrients, demonizing certain minerals, because we have this all or nothing approach to health. I understand with sugar because there's not much desirable in sugar, but salt is something that can be consumed in a balanced way and that is needed in the body. And so to say, well, we're going to tax the consumption of salt when you have people who are athletes, for example, who if they don't take sodium and potassium and magnesium will get cramps. What would be the threshold of sodium content that would apply? I don't know that we need a tax for everything. I think that perhaps we need incentives for certain things and certain behaviors that we want to encourage. That's one of the reasons we had talked about having this Wealth for Health grant, so that people who have been diagnosed as pre-diabetic or borderline hypertensive can, rather than us spending the money on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital to treat NCDs, we can give the resources as an incentive for people to be compliant with their treatment protocol, for people to exercise, for people to eat well. I think that we have to look at applying incentives, not just in the formal market industries, but where they really matter to the quality of people's lives. I support the target that has been identified by the honourable member, the tax expenditures in Barbados, the amount of revenue that we do not get, that government does not get because it is granting concessions to businesses, is unsustainable. On that, we agree. As we look at that balance, let us also look at how we can have a composition of those tax expenditures that does not just focus on incentivizing business, but also focuses on incentivizing the healthy behaviors and the kinds of lifestyles and the well-being of people that will bring about the Barbados that we want to see. So, sir, I do not raise any specific objection to the bill as set out, but it does not go far enough. And I believe that we have a responsibility to make more transparent and lay out more clearly what is the framework of fiscal incentives that people can reasonably expect when they invest in Barbados, and likewise, what are the incentives that are going to encourage us to engage in the behaviors that are going to redound to the benefit of all. With that, sir, I'm obliged.